Hello and welcome to my channel. I hope you enjoy this story. I'm going to try and upload a new story each day. The Haunting of Brook House. Holly Arnold had always dreamed of living by the sea. So when her family found the sprawling, dilapidated Brook House on the Isle of Wight for an impossibly low price, it felt like fate. The mansion sat atop a hill overlooking the waves, its cracked stone facade and ivy-choked walls speaking of a history long forgotten. Holly, her husband Sean, and their two young children Amber and Alex arrived on a misty autumn afternoon. As they pulled into the long, winding driveway, the air was thick with the scent of salt and decay. The house stood before them, towering and ancient. A sense of unease settled over Holly as she stepped out of the car, her eyes tracing the outline of the mansion's gabled roof. Brook House had once been grand, but now it seemed to sag under the weight of its past. The windows were dark, like eyes watching their every move. "Looks like we've got our work cut out for us," Sean said, trying to lighten the mood. But Holly could only manage a weak smile. Something about the house didn't feel right. Inside, the mansion was even more decrepit than the outside. The floorboards creaked beneath their feet, and a thick layer of dust covered every surface. The air was heavy, stale, as if the house had been holding its breath for years. As they explored, they found room after room of forgotten relics, old furniture draped in cobwebs, mirrors with cracks like spider webs, and faded portraits of long-dead inhabitants staring down from the walls. Amber and Alex ran ahead, their laughter echoing eerily through the empty halls. Holly called after them, but their voices seemed to fade into the house, swallowed by the silence. That night, after they had unpacked, the family settled into their new home. Holly couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. She lay awake in bed, listening to the wind howl outside and the distant crash of waves. Just as she was beginning to drift off, she heard a soft, shuffling sound coming from the hallway outside their bedroom. "Sean," she whispered, nudging him. "Do you hear that?" Sean stirred but didn't wake. Holly sat up, her heart pounding. The sound grew louder, closer. Slowly, she slipped out of bed and crept to the door. The hallway was dark, but she could make out the faint outline of someone moving at the far end. "Amber, Alex," she called softly, but there was no answer. Holly felt the cold chill crawl up her spine as the figure vanished into the shadows. She stood frozen for a moment before hurrying back to bed, pulling the covers up to her chin. She tried to tell herself it was just her imagination, the creaks of an old house settling. But deep down, she knew better. The next few days passed uneventfully, though the house continued to feel oppressive, as if it were watching them, waiting. Holly began to notice small things out of place, a door left open that she was sure she'd closed, objects moving ever so slightly. Once she found a doll sitting at the foot of Amber's bed that hadn't been there the night before. When she asked Amber about it, the little girl just shrugged. "I didn't put it there, Mommy. Maybe the lady did." Holly's blood ran cold. "What lady, sweetheart?" Amber pointed to the corner of the room. "The lady who watches us." Holly stared at the empty corner, her stomach knotting with dread. There was no one there. She forced a smile. "It's just your imagination, sweetie. No one's here but us." But as she turned to leave the room, she felt a cold breath on the back of her neck, like someone standing just behind her. Holly spun around, but the room was empty. That night the dreams began. In her sleep, Holly found herself wandering the dark halls of Brook House, though the house was different, whole, untouched by time. The walls were lined with fine paintings, the floors gleaming. She could hear voices, distant and indistinct, coming from somewhere deep within the house. She followed them, her footsteps silent on the polished wood. The voices grew louder, clear, a man and a woman arguing, their words sharp and angry. Suddenly, she was in a grand ballroom. A fire roared in the hearth, casting long shadows on the walls. In the center of the room stood a man and a woman, their faces pale and drawn. The woman was crying, her voice shaking as she pleaded with the man. But he was cold, unmoved, his eyes dark and empty. "You'll never leave this house," he hissed. "Not as long as I live." Holly woke with a start, her heart racing. She sat up, gasping for breath. The room was cold, far too cold for an autumn night. And then she heard it again, the shuffling sound outside her door. She bolted upright, her skin prickling with fear. The door creaked open slowly, and in the dim light Holly saw a figure standing in the doorway. A woman, dressed in tattered, old-fashioned clothing, her face pale and gaunt. Her eyes were hollow, her lips cracked and bloodless. "You must leave," the woman whispered, her voice barely audible. "He won't let you go," Holly screamed, waking Sean, who jumped out of bed, looking around in confusion. But the woman was gone. The door stood open, the hallway empty. The next morning, Holly insisted they leave, but Sean was skeptical. "It's just the stress of the move," he said, trying to calm her. "This house is old. Old houses make noise. There's no ghost." But Holly knew better. She could feel it, the malevolent presence that lingered in the house, watching them, waiting. As the days passed, the haunting grew worse. Doors slammed shut on their own, whispers echoed through the halls, and shadows moved where there should have been none. The children became withdrawn, their once bright laughter replaced by fearful silence. Holly found Alex hiding in a closet one afternoon, his eyes wide with terror. "He's here," Alex whispered, clutching his stuffed bear. "The man in the dark, he's coming for us." That night the air in Brook House was thick with tension. The storm outside had intensified, rain lashing against the windows. Holly lay awake, her heart pounding. She could hear the faint sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, creeping through the house. The door to their bedroom creaked open, and Holly saw him. The man from her dreams. He stood in the doorway, his eyes glowing with a cold, unnatural light. His face twisted into a cruel smile as he stepped toward her, his hand outstretched. "You can never leave," he whispered, his voice like the hiss of the wind. Holly screamed as the room plunged into darkness. The house groaned, the walls seeming to close in around her. She felt something cold wrap around her throat, tightening, suffocating her. And then, just as suddenly, it was over. Holly woke to daylight streaming through the windows. The storm had passed. But the house was different now, silent, still, empty. Sean and the children were gone. She searched the house, calling their names, but there was no answer. The only sound was the distant crash of the waves against the cliffs. Holly stood in the grand ballroom, the one from her dreams, staring at the fireplace. And then she saw the portrait hanging above the mantel, covered in dust and grime. It was of her family. Her family. Holly stared in horror at the painting. There she was, standing beside Sean and the children, their faces frozen in time, forever trapped within the walls of Brook House. They had never left. And they never would. Holly stumbled back from the portrait, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The impossible truth loomed before her. Her family was gone, swallowed by the house. She had always felt the house had a life of its own, but now it had claimed them, leaving her trapped in its clutches, caught between the living and the dead. She heard the echoes of their voices, faint but unmistakable, as if calling to her from somewhere deep within the mansion. Asterisk, Sean, Alex, Amber, asterisk, their names floated in the air like a mournful chant, growing louder, more insistent, beckoning her to follow. She ran through the house, desperately searching, retracing the steps of her dream. The corridor was twisted and changed, leading her deeper into the heart of Brook House, where the air was thick and suffocating. The walls seemed to pulse, alive with whispers, groans, and something else, a presence, a malicious force that had been watching her from the beginning. She finally reached the cellar door, which stood slightly ajar. A cold draught emanated from the depths below. In her gut, she knew that this was where the house wanted her to go. She hesitated, but the pull was too strong, her love for her family too deep. They were in there, she was sure of it, trapped in some twisted nightmare that only the house could create. With trembling hands, Holly pushed open the door and descended the rickety staircase into the darkness. The cellar was vast, much larger than she had imagined. The damp stone walls were lined with shelves full of decayed objects, forgotten relics from the mansion's previous inhabitants. At the far end of the room, she saw a large, ornate mirror covered in dust. It was out of place in the cold, musty cellar, like it belonged somewhere grander. Something about it made Holly's skin crawl. As she approached, she could see shapes moving in the glass shadows, flickering and writhing. Her breath caught in her throat as she wiped away the dust. The reflection that stared back at her was not her own. It was the family from her dream. The woman, gaunt and sorrowful, and the man, his face twisted with anger and madness. They stood behind her in the reflection, as if they were there in the room with her. Holly spun around, but the cellar was empty. Suddenly, the mirror began to ripple, as though it were made of water, and the figures in the glass shifted. Holly watched in horror as her own family appeared within the mirror. Sean, Alex, Amber, they stood frozen, trapped, their faces pale and expressionless. "Let them go!" Holly screamed, pounding on the glass. "Please take me instead." The malevolent figure of the man stepped forward in the reflection, his eyes burning with cold fire. His voice echoed in her mind, low and venomous. "They are mine now, as you will be soon. This house has claimed many, and it will continue to do so forever. No." Holly screamed, refusing to accept the fate laid out before her. She felt the walls closing in, the dark presence enveloping her like a suffocating fog. In a desperate act, she grabbed a shard of broken glass from the floor, her reflection catching the jagged edge. With a primal scream, she slanted into the mirror, shattering the surface. The glass exploded outward, and as the pieces fell to the ground, so too did the ghostly images within. The house groaned in protest, a terrible sound that reverberated through its ancient bones. The cellar began to shake violently, the floor buckling beneath her feet. Holly stumbled backward, her head spinning. The mirror, what was left of it, faded into darkness, and for a moment she thought it was over. But then she felt a cold hand clamping down on her shoulder. She turned, and there he was. The man from the reflection. The figure who had haunted her dreams, who had claimed her family. "You should never have come here," he whispered, his voice filled with malice. His grip tightened, and Holly felt the cold seep into her bones. The house trembled, and she could feel it consuming her, piece by piece. But in that moment, something stirred within Holly, a fierce determination. She had lost so much already, but she wasn't going to let the house take everything. Not without a fight. With all her strength, Holly broke free from the man's grip and ran. She fled up the stairs through the twisting corridors of Brook House, the walls warping and twisting around her. The house seemed to scream, furious that its prey was escaping. As Holly reached the front door, she felt the house closing in, its malevolent force surging forward to pull her back into the darkness. But she didn't stop. With a final burst of energy, she threw open the door and stumbled into the light of day. The sky was a pale grey, the storm long gone. The sea roared in the distance, but the oppressive silence of Brook House was gone. Holly fell to her knees on the gravel driveway, gasping for air, her heart racing. She looked back at the house, expecting to see it still looming over her, but it was different now. The shadows that had clung to its walls had receded, and the air around it was still. But her family, Sean, Alex, Amber, they were gone. Holly's heart ached with a grief so deep it felt like it would tear her apart. She could feel the house watching her, still waiting, always hungry. It had let her go, but at a terrible cost. She stood, her legs shaking, and walked away from Brook House. She could never return. The house might have released her, but it had taken everything she loved. As she reached the road, Holly glanced back one last time. In the window of the grand ballroom, she saw them, Sean, Alex, Amber, watching her, their faces pale, their eyes empty. Trapped in Brook House forever. Holly turned away, her heart heavy with sorrow, and disappeared down the road, leaving the house behind. But Brook House waited. And it would wait forever. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this story. Please don't forget to like, and even better, like and subscribe. Thank you very much, and I hope you have had or have a great day.